Welcome into episode 90 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
Have you ever made your own website? When you register a domain, one of the first things you do is fill in your contact info. Unless you pay a bit more, that info ends up as part of the public record in what's known as the WHOIS database. Whether that's good or bad is up for debate, but it's all about to change anyway, thanks to some new regulations in the European Union. The effects of the changes are pretty wide-reaching, and they mark a big milestone in efforts for online privacy. Now, the short name for the new rules is GDPR, and that's where our list begins. Items on today's list: what is GDPR? What is WHOIS? How does GDPR affect WHOIS? Can ICANN find a solution? And finally, we'll look at some of the upsides and downsides of all of these changes. So let's start at the top. What is GDPR?
Well, GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, the result of 4 years of work by the European Union dealing with the safe and responsible use of technology. While the rules only apply to EU member states, international organizations, businesses, and websites who interact or do business with EU residents have to comply with them as well. And that's caused some companies concern, particularly in the US. But we'll get to that a little bit later. The idea behind GDPR is to create a new set of common standards covering issues like how data breaches are reported and how user data is handled and stored. After years of work and warning, GDPR is set to go into effect this week on May 25th, 2018. Affected organizations have had a lot of time to get ready, and yet many businesses outside the EU, especially in the United States, aren't fully aware that these new rules exist. Not complying with these rules could be costly. Breaking some of the most serious rules concerning the proper handling of user data can lead to huge fines of either 20 million euros or 4% of the company's total annual revenue, whichever one is bigger. There are smaller fines as well, but the point is there are big consequences for companies that break or ignore the GDPR.
Now, I've got some of the rules listed here, so why don't we do a bit of call and response. I'll name the rule, and you tell me what it is or what we're talking about.
All right.
Privacy by default and by design.
Privacy by default is a simple concept. GDPR ensures that whenever options relating to user data exist, they should default to the most privacy-friendly choice, ensuring no accidental opt-ins. Privacy by design is similar in that developers creating new systems must build privacy considerations into planning and development from start to finish.
That's interesting. So, it really does have to be, you say ensuring no accidental opt-ins. Not only can it be accidental opt-ins, but you can't have something that, that you have to opt out of. Basically, they need your permission to use your data, not you need to make sure that you stop them from using it if you want it not used.
Exactly.
All right. Next up, the right to be forgotten.
In certain conditions, organizations that hold an EU citizen's data must delete it within 30 days. The most important case, when a user says they want the data deleted.
Okay. Better breach notification rules.
No more hearing about your data being lost months or years later. GDPR contains rules that require companies to report breaches within 72 hours to their country's newly created GDPR supervisory agency. These rules may apply to notifying users as well. The only exception is if the company can demonstrate clearly that no ill effects are possible.
So individual users might not hear about every data breach, but governments and authorities will.
Yeah.
Okay. Pseudonymization and user privacy. I can try that without laughing if you want. It's a big word, though. It's a tough word. Pseudonymization and user privacy.
That sounded good.
Thanks. I appreciate
that.
That
Very well. Organizations need to try to make information that identifies a user hard to find.
Okay. So is that across the board or just in certain circumstances? I mean, like if I make my username on a group my actual name, that's on me, right? I mean, this is about, well, this one kind of confuses me a bit.
Yeah, it's the thing is with GDPR is, yes, it's been in the works for a while, but a lot of these kind of questions are still up in the air, and I don't think we're going to have the real answer on it until we see it in action in practice and start seeing lawsuits. To be honest, I think if a user is the one who's providing that information, intentionally making that public, they make their username their actual name, that would be on the user versus the company. This is more of like identifying info in a public database, something like WHOIS does.
So one of the organizations in the States, and you just mentioned them by name a moment ago, one of the organizations in the States having a particularly hard time with GDPR is the group behind the WHOIS domain registry database. I mean, GDPR makes it almost impossible for WHOIS to keep doing what it does, at least doing it the way it does. But I don't even know why it has to do what it does. So I guess the question I have is, what is WHOIS?
Factually, it's a protocol used for asking registration databases for information on a particular domain. But people use the name to refer to the entire system for saving and retrieving registration data. Rules governing WHOIS are managed by ICANN. That's the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And if you go to a registrar or even ICANN's website and plug in any web address, you can find information about who registered it. Now, on the one hand, this makes sense. It's important for authorities to know who owns and operates a domain if that domain is used for something illegal. On the other hand, privacy, because privacy. Today, there aren't as many public contact details available through WHOIS as there used to be. And that's thanks to the rise in popularity of WHOIS privacy, or proxy registration. By paying an additional fee during registration, users can shield their information from public view. And that's important considering exactly what information WHOIS has, which includes names, organizations, full street address, phone number, fax number, and email addresses, which spammers love to grab through the WHOIS database.
All right, so it sounds like these are at loggerheads, because GDPR is about giving people the right to, hide or erase their information. WHOIS is about making sure someone knows who's behind what online. How can these two things work together?
Well, the way WHOIS works right now, they can't. GDPR makes continuing to maintain WHOIS as is practically impossible. Now, they could try having a different set of rules for EU citizens versus everyone else, but that would be an enforcement nightmare for the thousands of registrars around the world. And that means that when GDPR goes into effect, a lot of the information that is currently available publicly will go away. If not right away, then pretty soon thereafter. The specific GDPR rules concern limiting the information organizations collect, minimizing the amount of processing it undergoes, and restricting access to that data only to those who need it to provide a service, such as domain registration. Registrars in Europe have been working towards compliance for a long time, but ICANN, whose own regulations say that WHOIS data has to be publicly available, has taken its time coming up with a GDPR compliance plan.
So this starts tomorrow as this podcast goes out, initially. GDPR goes into effect tomorrow and ICANN isn't ready.
No, even though they've had a lot of time to get ready. These rules have been established and on the way for nearly 2 years. And it seems authorities at ICANN either thought they'd be exempt or didn't realize how much the new laws would affect their old system. And it also seems that the issue wasn't taken seriously until a registrar operating in Europe, providing access to domains such as .frl and .amsterdam, got a breach of contract notice from ICANN. ICANN said the organization's lack of a WHOIS system was a violation, and that registrar turned around and argued that the upcoming GDPR rules nullified their contract. And so that kicked off a late rush to try and figure out how to change the system to be compliant with the new rules without eliminating it entirely. ICANN is often lobbied by both law enforcement and legal departments filled with copyright lawyers looking to defend intellectual property, and they often rely on information from WHOIS or from registrars directly to track down pirates or potential bad guys. ICANN then asked the individual data protection authorities overseeing GDPR for a time extension or an exemption to the law, and that's not likely as the EU doesn't want to carve out exemptions to an individual's personal privacy. Now, the question is whether ICANN will face those stiff fines we mentioned earlier. ICANN has proposed the bare bones of a system that would maintain a way to grant privileged access to data privately to law enforcement while removing the publicly available WHOIS service. But the changes they proposed would take from months to years to implement.
Well, one thing right there is think about that extra privacy service that you pay for. You know, that little tax you pay for to have your privacy. How much money are they going to lose off of that? I mean, if things are changing in this way, like what exactly? That's a lot of money that somebody's going to be missing out on.
And here's a little background on the whole WHOIS thing for our listeners. When you register a domain and you provide that information to WHOIS, and you have to actually make sure it's up to date every single year, they say it's so people can contact you if there's a technical issue or with investigations, any of that kind of stuff. I mean, if somebody wants to buy your domain, they could look at your WHOIS data and try and contact you. The issue is you have two choices. You either have to provide valid contact information, so you can't just, give a non-existent address, non-existent email address, non-existent phone number. You have to give real stuff, or you have to pay extra for this proxy registration, in which case somebody else, it provides this kind of shielded, like this is registered by domains by proxy, or whichever one you go with. Here's an email address you can contact us at. Here's a phone number you can contact us at. And that proxy registration service will forward on any emails they get to you without exposing your email address publicly. So essentially, if you want privacy right now, with the way WHOIS currently works, you have to pay for it. And these EU regulations with GDPR are essentially just going to say, oh, no, you don't have to pay for it because there isn't going to be any of this data out there.
That's almost like what we were talking about earlier about opt-in versus opt-out. Mm-hmm. Like right now, you have to pay to opt out of WHOIS, which you're not even really opting out of WHOIS. You're just making it so that, every John and Jane can't find the information. But the way GDPR is set up, you would have to opt in. But again, I mean, you pretty much have to put all of your information on your forward-facing website at that point if you wanted to have that information publicly available. But why would anybody want to have that information publicly available? Unless you're that guy from LifeLock.
Didn't his social security number get stolen and used like 30 times?
Maybe a couple times.
I don't really think you can say stolen if he's putting it on the side of a truck and driving it around Manhattan.
Freely used.
Exactly. Yeah, the point is, though, okay, so GDPR is basically like a built-in, it's not even an opt-in. It's not an opt-in or opt-out. It's as you just said, the information's just not going to be available, theoretically. But, then again, there's all the problems that WHOIS and ICANN are having. But we've kind of hit those. Aside from the problems for WHOIS and ICANN, what are the upsides and downsides that you guys see coming from these changes?
Well, we'll start with the good points. Upside, spammers won't be able to access your information and call you up with offers of free cruises if you'll just hand over your bank account info for verification. Your email won't get clogged up with even more spam either. It's a win-win for general privacy advocates too. That's another upside. These changes could allow some to feel empowered to register a site to use for speaking their mind. This could be very important in countries where political freedoms might be limited. Keeping this information from public view makes good sense given the broader concerns about personal data on the web. That said, there are downsides, not only for law enforcement and those intellectual property lawyers we mentioned earlier, but for security researchers as well. Sometimes researchers use WHOIS data to understand the relationships between sites pumping out malware. For example, a reverse WHOIS search could allow a researcher to find other websites registered with an email account used by the malware author. That might lead to the discovery of command and control methods, more malware attack vectors, or even point towards the author themselves.
That's something that has actually come up a fair amount in security research. Is you'll have a malware author who years down the road, they were doing whatever when they were naive and young and weren't keeping track of their privacy as much. And then later on, they're kind of, a hardened hacker and they create some piece of malware and they get busted because they registered some domain way back in the day with a email address that pointed to a username on a forum that led authorities back to this person. So that is, a real downside that kind of affects us as security researchers. That is taking away one of the tools we can use to track these bad guys down, track malware. But, it is a trade-off between, that weighed against user privacy overall. So
what, there's not going to be some cool API or some subscription service that we could opt into to have access to all this data, even though?
There you go. It's a new business model.
That's a great, and when I say great, I mean terrible. Can we just talk about this personally? How do you guys feel about these changes? I mean, first of all, how smoothly is this likely to go? I mean, when you're dealing with the EU versus, I don't want to say versus the rest of the world, but when you're dealing with the EU and then the rest of the planet, how smoothly is that likely to go? And if you don't mind saying, how do you feel about the changes that GDPR represents?
I think overall, I'm really of two minds on this. I like the privacy aspect. I like the fact that I won't have to keep paying, an extra $8 a domain per year or $10 or whatever it is for private registration. I like that. Yes, it's going to be harmful to me as a malware researcher, though, for kind of tracking some of these correlations between different websites serving up malware and kind of trying to figure out the path that a malware author's taken online. As far as how easy it's all going to be to implement, in the past, a lot of the changes coming out of the EU were more with e-commerce stuff. I know one that kind of came up somewhat recently was for subscriptions. You have to give EU users knowledge ahead of time with auto renewing subscriptions that's going to renew, give them a way to opt out. They have a 30 or 60-day period or something like that where they can opt out and get a full refund, no questions asked, stuff like that. And that's all been stuff that is usually implemented on the part of our e-commerce provider. And GDPR is a little different. So it's more one that we as a company ourselves have to pay a lot more attention to, and other small companies as well. It's not something where you're relying on your web host or your e-commerce provider to take care of all the details. There's kind of a bunch of little things that you have to be aware of, especially if you have any sort of user database system or way for users to register. It's going to be something that a lot of companies have to see if it affects them and take steps if need be. So I don't think it's going to be. I don't think it will be as implemented as smoothly as anybody would like. But I guess it'll be a learning process for everybody.
So, we said that fines could happen not only for EU companies, but for basically any e-commerce company that does international business. And the way software sales work, you're generally selling to everybody out there, right? So you have a lot of big and small businesses selling software. What do you think the legal team is like between GDPR and going after those fines, and what kind of force do you think that'll be like?
Are they going to go after just the big offenders, or are they going to go after the small fries too? That's there was a kind of a funny, at first I thought it was a joke, and apparently it's not. There's some site or service out there now that will essentially, you buy their service and it checks I think it's just going by IP address, the IP address of visitors to your website. And if it's detecting that they're coming from a EU country, it just blocks them from going to your website.
Yeah,
and the
I saw that.
Selling point is don't worry about GDPR compliance, because we just make it so no EU customers can access your website whatsoever. And of course, that's not going to be a bulletproof solution, and probably isn't the best route to go. But apparently, people are going that route because that's going to be cheaper and easier than figuring out the whole compliance thing.
And I think definitely it will be, the force that suddenly all these fines are being issued, where people take it seriously and go, okay, yeah, I guess we need to start doing all these things. Otherwise, I think it'll be one of those, yeah, we only have like 2 or 3 people, or 4 times however many,
And the real challenge here, I think, is that they're trying to shoehorn this into an existing system that is built on the opposite of privacy. The internet, the way it was set up, was all about connectedness and sharing data and sharing information and not worrying about security or privacy or any of this stuff. And the problem now is we're working on a system that's however many decades old, not really meant for any of the security privacy stuff. And so trying to shoehorn in more regulations and change some of these fundamental ways that the internet has worked is not going to be easy. You almost wonder with this if it wouldn't be easier just to start from scratch, make a new secure internet with privacy and all that stuff in mind. No, I mean seriously,
I heard they were working on that already.
When you're doing something like this, when you're changing some of these fundamentals and the way things have worked for years, is never going to be easy, especially when it's you're talking about a global internet, and then you have laws from different countries around the world. Who's enforcing them, where they're enforced, all that stuff. So it'll be interesting, but it's not going to be painless. That's for sure.
See, there are 2 things that leap to mind. I mean, one, on the sort of not quite dystopian, but sort of not pleasant side. I mean, it almost sounds like you're running the risk of creating another great firewall. I mean, where, okay, the EU is going to be so much trouble to deal with that we're just going to block them. I mean, which it goes to that thing that you were talking about earlier. Is that realistic? Probably not. At the same time, who wants to look at the possibility of millions of euros in fines for not even realizing that something was going to affect them, which I got to imagine is the case for a number of small businesses out there. Not that what you were saying was a laughing matter, but when you were talking about a security internet, or more starting over with a more secure internet, the reason I started laughing was because I was like, ooh, and we'll call it Internet 2.0. Because I'm pretty sure nobody's ever used that term ever before, ever. So as extensive as all this was, there's actually a lot more to know. If you want to dig deeper, a great place to start is the website for this show, SecureMac.com/checklist. You'll find notes there on every show that we've ever done before, and every show that we do from now on, once we actually do those shows, SecureMac.com/checklist. If you have a question you'd like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. And we'll talk to you next week.